The sun over Scorpion Creek showed no mercy. It baked the dust into a fine, choking powder that coated every soul who dared to walk the street. Rowena Hayes felt that powder in her throat as she drew the last bucket of water from her nearly dry well. That's when she saw him, a shape, not a man, staggering out of the shimmering heat. He collapsed by her fence, his body nothing but rags and bone. The town law Sheriff Brody watched from his porch, spitting tobacco. He'd let the man die. But Rowena, gripping her bucket, walked toward him. That single act of offering water was an act of rebellion, one that would unravel a secret buried in blood and dust. The heat was a physical weight in Scorpion Creek. It pressed down on the warped wooden planks of the saloon, on the scorched hides of the cattle in Barrett Kane's vast pens, and on the spirit of Rowena Hayes. Rowena was a woman carved from the same unyielding landscape. Her homestead, a small, stubborn patch of defiance at the edge of Kane's massive K-Bar ranch, was all she had. Her well was running dry, her patch of corn was wilting, and Mr. Hendry at the Mercantile had just refused her credit. She was, in the language of the territory, one bad day from bust. She hauled the creaking bucket up from the well, the water inside distressingly low and cloudy. It was just enough for her and her old mule, Patches. That's when the stranger appeared. He didn't ride in. He didn't walk. He crawled from the open desert, a shimmering mirage of desperation. He was young, but the desert had aged him, cracking his lips and burning his skin through the tears in his filthy shirt. He made it to her fence post and collapsed, his breath a dry, rasping sound. From the shaded porch of the Gilded Cactus Saloon, Sheriff Brody watched. He didn't move. He simply spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dust. In Scorpion Creek, a town owned lock, stock, and barrel by Barrett Kane, strangers were not welcome. Vagrancy was a crime, and dying of thirst was simply the sentence. Rowena looked at the water in her bucket. It was her life for the next day. She looked at the stranger. He was a dead man. She looked at Sheriff Brody, whose cold eyes dared her. Rowena's grandfather, a man who had died trying to hold this very land, had always told her, "Don't let the land make you as hard as it is." With a sigh that kicked up a small puff of dust at her feet, Rowena lifted the bucket. She walked past the invisible line of her property and knelt beside the stranger. "Drink?" she said, her voice rough. She lifted his head. He was lighter than a sack of grain. He moaned, uncomprehending. Rowena dipped the tin cup into her precious water and pressed it to his broken lips. He coughed, then drank, his eyes screwed shut. He drank with a desperate, animalistic thirst that spoke of days, not hours. Without water. Across the street, the saloon doors swung open, and Gant, Barrett Kane's foreman, stepped out. He was a big man, built of muscle and casual cruelty. He saw Rowena, he saw the vagrant, and he laughed. "Well, looky here," Gant's voice boomed across the street. "If it ain't St. Rowena, wasting good water on coyote bait." Sheriff Brody finally stood up, buckling his gun belt. "Rowena," he called, his voice flat. "You know Mr. Kane's rules. No vagrants. He clutters up the view." The stranger had drunk 3 full cups before his eyes rolled back, and he passed out, his head lolling in Rowena's arm. Rowena looked up, her blue eyes as hard as desert turquoise. "He's on my land now, Sheriff, and he ain't vagrant if he's working. I'm hiring him." Gant's laughter stopped. Brody's hand, which had been resting on his gun, froze. This was not in the script. Rowena Hayes, the woman who was days from being auctioned off her own land, was defying the unspoken law of Scorpion Creek. "He's hired to fix the fence," she said, her voice wavering only slightly. Brody squinted. "He don't look like he can stand, let alone work." "He will," Rowena said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get my employee out of the sun." She gritted her teeth, put her shoulder under the stranger's arm, and hauled. He was heavier than she thought. With a strength born of pure, mule-headed stubbornness, she dragged the unconscious man from the street, past her gate, and toward the shade of her small, dilapidated barn. She didn't look back, but she could feel the eyes of Brody and Gant burning into her back. She had just done more than offer a man a drink. She had drawn a line in the sand. And in a town like Scorpion Creek, that was the same as drawing a target on your own back. The barn was hot, but it was shade. It smelled of dry hay and old leather. Rowena laid the stranger on an old cot, his breathing still shallow. For the first time, she got a good look at him. He was young, perhaps her own age, in his mid-20s. The rags he wore had once been fine clothes, a linen shirt, now shredded, and tailored trousers, now caked with mud and blood. His hands were not the calloused, thick hands of a labourer. They were blistered and torn, but the fingers were long and slender. Most telling was the item she found clutched in his right hand, so tightly she had to pry his fingers open. It wasn't a gun or a knife. It was a small, silver locket, tarnished and dented, hanging from a broken leather cord. He had held on to it even when dying of thirst. She spent the afternoon forcing sips of water and thin broth into him. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering words she couldn't catch. The fire, the charter, Vasto Verde. Must tell. Outside, the town was watching. No one came to visit, but she saw Mr. Hendry from the Mercantile, looking toward her place, then quickly turning away when he saw her. The isolation she had always felt was now complete. She was a pariah. As dusk painted the desert in shades of bruised purple and orange, Sheriff Brody returned. He didn't stop at the gate. He rode his horse right up to her porch, an act of pure intimidation. "Evening, Rowena." "Sheriff," she said, not moving from her doorway. "My associates," he said, nodding toward Gant, who was sitting on his own horse at the gate, "are concerned. Mr. Kane values order. That man you dragged in, he looks like trouble." "He's just a man." "Sick," Rowena replied. "That's the thing," Brody said, leaning down from his saddle, his voice dropping. "We ran a check on the telegraph, reports from Santa Fe. They're looking for a man matching his description, an escapee from a sanitarium up north, supposed to be dangerous, delusional. Thinks he's a king or something." Rowena's stomach tightened. A lunatic? The doctor's name on the wire was a Dr. Leopold. Says the man is prone to violence and spinning wild tales. The reward for his return is generous. I haven't heard him say anything," Rowena lied. Brody smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "Mr. Kane is a generous man. He'd pay that reward himself, just to keep the peace. He wants that man. Bring him to my office in the morning, for your own safety, of course." He tipped his hat and turned his horse. "Morning, Rowena. Don't be late." Gant gave her a final, leering look before following. Rowena's hands were shaking. She was in over her head. A dangerous lunatic. She barricaded her door, something she hadn't done in years, and went back to the barn, her heart pounding. The stranger was awake. His eyes were open, and for the first time they were clear. They were a deep, intelligent grey. They were here," he whispered. His voice was a rasp. "Who?" Rowena asked, her hand instinctively going to the small hatchet she kept for chopping kindling. "Brody, I heard his voice." "You know Sheriff Brody?" The man pushed himself up on one elbow, a painful grimace crossing his features. He works for Kane." "Everyone works for Barrett Kane," Rowena said bitterly. "No," the man insisted, his eyes locking on hers. "You don't understand. Brody, he was there, the night of the fire." "What are you talking about? What fire?" The man's gaze was intense. "My name," he choked out, "is Owen Macpherson, and Barrett Kane murdered my entire family." Rowena stared, the hatchet slipping from her grip. Brody had said he was delusional, prone to spinning wild tales. But the look in this man's eyes was not madness. It was a grief so profound and a fury so cold it made the desert heat feel like a distant memory. "Macpherson," Rowena repeated, the name rattling something loose in her memory. It was an old name, one she'd heard her grandfather whisper, a name that belonged to the valley itself, long before it was called Scorpion Creek. "They said you were an escapee," she said. "From a sanitarium." Owen let out a dry, hacking laugh that turned into a cough. "The sanitarium run by Dr. Leopold? Of course. Kane is thorough. He doesn't just kill you, he kills your name. He locked me away to make sure the last Macpherson was officially labeled insane." He fumbled with the locket, his fingers too weak to open it. Rowena took it gently. She pressed the catch. Inside, it was not a portrait. It was a tiny, intricate carving, a map, or more precisely, a crest, a lion and a cypress tree, intertwined. "My family's crest," Owen whispered. "The sacred line, the only line. We weren't just settlers, Rowena. We founded this valley, and I'm the last blood." Owen Macpherson, propped up on the cot with a blanket around his shoulders, looked nothing like the dangerous lunatic Sheriff Brody had described. He looked like a man haunted. "The sacred line, as my father called it," Owen began, his voice strengthening with every word, "isn't a holy title, it's a legal one. My ancestor, Don Miguel Macpherson, a Scotsman who married into a Spanish noble family, received a direct land grant from the King of Spain in 1788. The Vasto Verde grant." Rowena listened, captivated. She had heard whispers of an old Spanish grant, but in the chaos of the territory, such claims were paper ghosts. "It covers this entire valley," Owen continued, his hand gesturing weakly toward the hills. "Everything you see. Scorpion Creek, the K-Bar, even your homestead. My family held it for nearly a century. We weren't barons like Kane. We worked with the land. We built the original mission, the irrigation canals. We had compacts with the local Apache." "What happened?" Rowena asked. A shadow passed over Owen's face. "Barrett Kane happened. He arrived 15 years ago, just a silver prospector with a smile. My father, Angus Macpherson, was a trusting man. He saw Kane as a sign of progress. He gave him a lease to prospect in the eastern hills. Kane found more than silver. He found ambition." Owen's story tumbled out, a dark river of betrayal. Kane used his lease to build a private army of men like Gant. He bribed railroad surveyors to route the new line through his leased land, not the main Macpherson homestead. Then, when the railroad came, he used his new power to create the town of Scorpion Creek, strangling the old Macpherson ranch. "My father tried to fight him legally," Owen said. "He went to Santa Fe to have the Vasto Verde grant ratified by the U.S. territorial government. That was his mistake. Why? Because it showed Kane exactly what he needed to steal. 10 years ago, on the night of the solstice feast, Kane made his move. He and his men, Brody was one of them, a new deputy then, rode to our ranch. They barricaded the doors and set it on fire." Rowena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I was 16, Owen whispered, his eyes distant and dead. "My father pushed me through a small window in the root cellar. He told me to run and to never forget who I was. He gave me this." He touched the locket. I watched from the creek bed as my home burned, with my parents and my little sister inside. He'd fled into the desert, eventually found by missionaries who took him to Santa Fe. He'd spent years in an orphanage, under an assumed name, trying to get strong, trying to find a way. When I turned 21, I tried to file the claim, he said, his voice thick with anger. That's when I learned how deep Cain's influence went. The day I filed, I was arrested on a trumped-up charge. Then Dr. Leopold, a man on Cain's payroll, declared me mentally unfit, suffering from delusions of grandeur. Cain didn't want to just kill the last McPherson. He wanted to discredit him, to make the sacred line a madman's fantasy. He had spent the last 4 years in Leopold's private sanitarium, a prison of whitewashed walls and barred windows, until 2 weeks ago, when a fire, a real, accidental fire, gave him his chance to escape. He'd been walking ever since, trying to get back. "Why come back?" Rowena asked, her mind reeling. "Why not run?" "Because he doesn't have it," Owen said, a sudden, fierce light in his eyes. "Have what?" "The grant, the original Vasto Verde Charter. It's a vellum scroll, signed by the king. My father, he was a scholar. He knew Cain was a brute. He wouldn't keep the charter in a safe. He hid it." "Where?" Owen looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "He hid it in plain sight. In the old mission, the one my family built, which Cain now uses as his personal, fortified hacienda. My father told me the night of the fire, the line is protected by the lion and the cypress. Our family crest. It's carved into the keystone of the fireplace in the main hall." He slumped back, exhausted by the confession. "I came back to retrieve it. It's the only proof. Without it, I'm just the lunatic Brody says I am." The barn was silent, save for the sound of their breathing. Rowena's world had been turned upside down. This wasn't a vagrant. This was a prince, stripped of his kingdom. And Barrett Cain wasn't just a ruthless cattle baron. He was a monster. "Brody will be back in the morning," Rowena said, her voice practical, though her hands were shaking. "He expects me to hand you over." "I know," Owen said. "I won't let him take me." "He's not taking you," Rowena said, a new hardness in her own voice. "But you can't stay here. This barn won't stop him for 5 minutes." She paced the small space. "My grandfather, he dug storm cellars all over this property. He was terrified of twisters, even though there are none here. There's one under the old smokehouse, behind the woodpile. It's small, but it's hidden. Brody won't find you there." "Rowena, you can't," Owen said. "He'll destroy you. He'll take your land. You heard him. He's already taking my land," Rowena shot back, her own anger surprising her. "My father and grandfather built this place from nothing. Cain has been choking us for years. He dammed the creek, dried up our water. He charges freight tariffs that bleed us dry. He's foreclosing on this homestead next month." She looked at Owen, her decision made. "I thought I was fighting for a patch of dust. Maybe we're fighting for the same thing. Justice." She helped him to his feet. "Get in the cellar. I'll deal with Brody." The morning sun was an accusation. Rowena hadn't slept. She had moved Owen to the cramped, dusty cellar, hidden behind a stack of old firewood, leaving him with a canteen of water and a hunk of bread. At precisely 8 o'clock, she heard the jingle of spurs. Sheriff Brody was not alone. Gant was with him, as was a third man, a stocky, silent brute named Pike. They didn't knock. Brody simply pushed her front door open. "He's not in the house," Rowena said, standing by her cold stove, her arms crossed. Brody ignored her and went through the small cabin anyway, kicking open her bedroom door and glancing under her bed. "Polite of you to save me the trouble." He walked back out onto the porch. "The barn, Gant." He's not in there either, Rowena said, following him out. We'll see. Gant and Pike ransacked the barn. They overturned the cot, kicked over feed sacks, and stabbed at the loose hay with pitchforks. Rowena held her breath, her heart pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it. Gant approached the woodpile at the back of the barn, near the old smokehouse. Rowena's heart stopped. "Nothing here, boss," Gant called, kicking the bottom log. "Just firewood." Brody walked over, his eyes scanning the area. He was smarter than Gant. He looked at the dust on the floor. He looked at the woodpile. "This wood," he said, touching a log. "It's dry. Been here a while. But the dust on top, it's disturbed." He fixed his cold eyes on Rowena. "Move the wood." "That's my winter fuel," Rowena protested. "You're not—" I said, "Move the wood, Rowena, or Pike will, and he's not gentle." Slowly, her shoulders slumped. Rowena walked over and pulled away the first log, then another. Brody watched her, a small, cruel smile playing on his lips. He knew he had her. She pulled back the last of the logs, revealing the heavy wooden trap-door to the cellar. "Well, well," Brody said. "Open it." Rowena's hands trembled as she lifted the iron ring. The door creaked open, revealing the dark, square hole. "Come on out, lunatic," Brody called into the darkness, "or we're coming in." There was a silence. Then, a voice from the darkness. "Leave her alone." Owen McPherson emerged, blinking in the sudden light. He was weak, but he stood tall, his eyes blazing with contempt. "Owen McPherson," Brody said, his smile widening. "So the rumors were true, the last of the line. Kane will be delighted." "He's a murderer," Owen said. "He's the law," Brody corrected. "And so am I. You're under arrest. For escaping a medical facility. For trespassing. For, oh, I don't know. Being a general nuisance." Gant and Pike grabbed Owen's arms, shoving him forward. "No!" Rowena cried, stepping in front of them. "You can't!" Gant laughed and backhanded her. The blow sent her sprawling into the dust. "Rowena!" Owen roared, surging against the two men, but he was too weak. Pike slammed the butt of his rifle into Owen's stomach, and he collapsed, gasping. Now, Brody said, pulling Rowena to her feet by her hair. Her scalp screamed in pain. "That's what you get for siding with trash. You see, Rowena, this whole valley is Kane's, and when you live in a man's house, you follow his rules." He shoved her toward her cabin. "Consider this your final notice. I'm posting the foreclosure. You've got 24 hours to be off this land. This homestead," he said, spitting the word, "belongs to Mr. Kane now." "You can't," Rowena whispered, tasting blood on her lip. "I just did." Brody mounted his horse. "Gant, Pike, bring the patient to the jail. Dr. Leopold will be so happy to have him back." Rowena watched, helpless, as they dragged Owen away. The man she had tried to save was now in the hands of his family's killer, and in the process, she had lost everything. The land her grandfather had died for was gone. She stood there for a long time, the dust settling around her. The silence of the empty homestead was deafening, but as the minutes turned into an hour, her despair began to curdle into something else. It wasn't fear, it was rage, a cold, quiet rage that burned hotter than the desert sun. Barrett Kane had taken her future. Sheriff Brody had taken her dignity. They had made a fatal mistake. They had left her with nothing to lose. Rowena did not pack. She did not cry. She went to the dry well and stared at her own reflection in the murky water at the bottom. They thought she was a saint. They thought she was a weak woman to be pushed aside. They were wrong. She went to the old chest at the foot of her bed, the one containing her grandfather's belongings. She bypassed her mother's quilts and her father's letters. At the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, were 2 items: a U.S. Army Colt revolver, heavy and well-oiled, and a detailed map of the Vasto Verde Valley. Her grandfather had been the original surveyor for the McPhersons. It all clicked into place. Her grandfather's obsession with the land, his whispered stories of the old Grant, his hatred for Kane. It wasn't just settlers' pride. He knew. The map was detailed, showing all the original McPherson holdings, and there, in the center, was the Mission de Cyprès, the mission of the cypress, which Kane now called his hacienda. The map even had a small, detailed drawing of the mission's interior. She knew she couldn't break Owen out of jail. Brody's office was a brick fortress, and Gant and Pike were always there. But Owen had told her the key. The line is protected by the lion and the cypress. The charter. If she could get the charter, the proof, it was no longer a madman's fantasy. It was a legal crisis for the territorial government. She had 24 hours. They wouldn't expect her to fight back. They would expect her to run. She saddled her mule, Patches. He was old, but he was quiet. She took the gun, a length of rope, and a pouch of her grandfather's old surveying tools, which included chisels and a small hammer. She didn't ride toward the town. She rode south into the broken canyons that bordered the K-Bar Ranch. She knew these trails. She'd played in them as a child. She knew a back way onto Kane's land, a path that no one used, a path that would take her to the cliffs behind the hacienda. She rode all day, staying low, using the arroyos and ridges for cover. By nightfall, she was overlooking the lion's den. Kane's hacienda was a fortress, just as Owen had said. It was the old mission, a 2-story adobe building surrounded by a high wall. Guards patrolled the perimeter. Lights blazed in the main hall. She could hear the tinny sound of a piano and raucous laughter. Kane was celebrating. She waited until after midnight. The moon was a sliver, and the party inside had grown quiet. The guards were sleepy. Rowena left Patches in a small grove of cottonwoods. Dressed in her darkest clothes, she scaled the crumbling rear wall of the old mission courtyard, a section her grandfather's map had marked as unrepaired. She landed silently in a kitchen garden. She was in. She moved like a shadow, using the skills of a homesteader, not a thief. She knew how to move without making a sound. She reached the main building. A window, left open for the night air, gave her entry into what looked like a pantry. The house was dark. She navigated by memory, following the layout from her grandfather's map. She found the main hall. It was a cavernous room, smelling of cigar smoke and spilled whiskey. A massive, long-horned skull hung over the entrance, and at the far end, the fireplace. It was enormous, built of river stone, and there, just as Owen had said, was the keystone. It was a single, large piece of sandstone. Carved into it, worn by time but unmistakable, was the McPherson crest, a lion rampant and a cypress tree, their branches and tails intertwined. It was real. Owen was telling the truth. She pulled the small chisel and hammer from her pouch. The keystones in these old missions weren't just decorative. They often concealed prayer niches, or in this case, a hidden compartment. She found the seam, just as the map had indicated. She worked carefully, chipping away the old mortar. It was slow, agonizing work. Every tap of the hammer sounded like a gunshot in the silent house. Tap, chip, tap, chip. Finally, the mortar gave way. The keystone was loose. Using the chisel as a lever, she prayed it wouldn't make a sound. It didn't. It pivoted smoothly on a hidden hinge, revealing a dark, square cavity. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She reached inside, her fingers brushing against leather. She pulled it out. It was a cylindrical case of tooled Spanish leather. sealed with wax. It was heavy. It was real. She had the vasto verde grant. A voice from the shadows behind her said, "I'll be taking that." Rowena froze. The blood drained from her face. Barrett Kane was sitting in a high-backed leather chair in the corner of the room, a glass of brandy in one hand and a gleaming revolver in the other. He hadn't been asleep. He had been waiting. "I must confess, I'm impressed," Kane said, stepping into the dim moonlight. He was a handsome man, with silver hair and dead grey eyes. "Brody said you were just a simple farm girl. He underestimated you." "Where is Owen?" Rowena spat, holding the charter to her chest. "Mr. Macpherson. He's in the jail where he belongs. We were going to ship him back to Dr. Leopold, but this is so much cleaner. Having you both here?" He smiled. "Thieves, caught in the act of robbing my home. Tragic." "It's his home," Rowena said. "This is the West, my dear. Home is just a word for whatever I can hold. And I hold it all. Now, give me the charter." "No," Kane sighed. "I admire spirit, I truly do, but it's so often wasted." He cocked the hammer of his revolver. "Gant!" The doors to the hall burst open. Gant and Pike stood there, grinning. "It seems you're outnumbered," Kane said. "I know," Rowena said. She hadn't just been holding the charter. Her other hand was in her pouch. "But I have a question for Gant." Gant looked confused. "What?" "My father," Rowena said, her voice shaking but clear. "His name was Thomas Hayes. He was a surveyor. He worked for you before he died. In a cave-in." Kane's smile faltered. "That was a long time ago. An accident." "Was it?" Rowena asked. "Because my grandfather kept everything, including my father's journals." This was a lie. She had no journals, but she had a guess. "My father found something, didn't he?" she said, her eyes locked on Gant's. "He was an honest man. He wouldn't go along with your land grab. So you and Kane, you made it a cave-in." Gant's grin vanished. "You're crazy, just like that Macpherson lunatic." "Am I?" Rowena said, and she pulled her hand from the pouch. It wasn't her grandfather's gun. It was a stick of dynamite, old, unstable, and with a very short fuse, from her grandfather's surveying kit, for clearing rock. She lit the fuse from a candle on the nearby table. The fuse sputtered to life. Gant and Pike's eyes went wide. Kane dove behind his heavy oak desk. "This is his home," Rowena screamed, "and his family's line." She threw the dynamite not at them, but at the heavy chandelier hanging above their heads. At the same time, she dove behind a heavy velvet couch, clutching the leather charter to her chest. The explosion was deafening. The blast tore the room apart. The chandelier, a massive iron and glass contraption, ripped from its ceiling mount and crashed down exactly where Gant and Pike had been standing. Plaster dust and smoke filled the air, choking and blinding. Rowena didn't wait. She scrambled from behind the couch, her ears ringing, and ran for the door. She heard a groan from beneath the wreckage of the chandelier. Gant or Pike, it didn't matter. She heard a roar of pure rage from behind the desk. You witch! Get her!" Barrett Kane emerged from the smoke, his face cut and bleeding. He fired his revolver, the shot deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet snapped past Rowena's ear, striking the door jamb. She didn't run for the pantry. She ran for the main doors, the ones she'd entered. She burst out into the courtyard, gasping for air. A guard, alerted by the blast, raised his rifle. "Stop!" Rowena didn't hesitate. She ran straight at him, using the one thing she had, the element of pure, unadulterated chaos. She was a woman on fire, a whirlwind of dust and fury. The guard, expecting a thief, not a banshee, faltered. She slammed the heavy leather charter case into his stomach, and he folded, gasping. She was at the wall. She threw the rope she'd carried, the grappling hook catching on the top. She was halfway up when a bullet ripped through the adobe just inches from her hand. Kane was in the doorway, reloading his revolver. "You won't escape!" he bellowed. She threw herself over the wall, landing hard on the other side, tumbling down the rocky slope. She ran for the cottonwoods, for Patches, her lungs burning. She heard them coming. Horses. They were sending riders. She reached the mule and threw herself into the saddle. "Go, Patches, go." But the old mule was no match for Kane's thoroughbreds. They would run her down in the open desert. She pulled on the reins, turning Patches not toward the open desert, but up, toward the high, broken cliffs. The path was narrow, a goat track, but she knew it. Gant, miraculously alive but with a bloody gash on his head, led the pursuit. "She's heading for the pass! Cut her off!" Rowena pushed Patches up the switchback. A rifle shot echoed, and a chip of rock exploded near her. They were closing. She reached the top of the small mesa. It was a dead end, a sheer drop on 3 sides. Gant, Pike, and 2 other riders cornered her. They fanned out, their rifles trained on her. "It's over, girl," Gant sneered, wiping blood from his eye. "Give us the tube and we'll make it quick." "Rowena!" a new voice yelled. From the other side of the pass, another rider appeared. It was Owen. He was on a horse, but he was slumped in the saddle and his hands were tied. Sheriff Brody was behind him, a shotgun leveled at Owen's back. "Well, this is a party," Brody said, his eyes landing on the leather case in Rowena's hand. "Looks like you did the hard work for us, Rowena. Now be a good girl. Throw the charter down, or your boyfriend here gets a new hole in his back." Rowena looked at Owen. His face was bruised, but his eyes were clear. He looked at her, then at the charter, and he gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No." I can't," Rowena said, her voice trembling. "Wrong answer," Brody said, and he thumbed back the hammer of his shotgun. "Wait," Rowena screamed. Okay, I'll give it to you." She held up the leather tube. "You want it? Come and get it." She urged Patches forward, toward Brody. "That's a good girl," Brody said, his shotgun still trained on Owen. Rowena rode slowly, her eyes darting between Brody and Gant. They had her. She was trapped. She was 10 feet from Brody when she yanked a small pouch from her belt. It wasn't dynamite. It was her grandfather's old surveyor's pouch, filled with fine, blinding white chalk powder for marking lines. With a scream, she threw the pouch straight into the face of Brody's horse. The horse screamed, a high-pitched whinny of terror, and reared, blinded by the powder. Brody, caught by surprise, fired his shotgun into the air as he was thrown from the saddle. Owen used the moment. He slammed his bound hands into the face of the man holding his reins. "Now, Rowena!" he yelled. Rowena didn't go for Brody. She spurred Patches straight at Gant. The old mule, in a surprising burst of speed, slammed into Gant's horse. As they collided, Rowena pulled her grandfather's Colt from her waistband. She didn't shoot Gant. She shot the rifle out of his hands, the bullet striking the wooden stock and sending the weapon spinning into the darkness. Gant stared at his stinging, empty hands, then at her, his face a mask of disbelief. "Run!" Owen yelled, having managed to get his horse under control. Rowena didn't need to be told twice. She and Owen galloped past the confused, blinded, and disarmed men, plunging back down the trail into the dark maze of canyons. They rode for hours, pushing the horses, until the sun began to light the eastern sky. They finally stopped in a hidden box canyon, the horses lathered and exhausted. They were alive. They were free. And in Rowena's lap, clutched tightly, was the leather tube. "You did it," Owen whispered, sliding from his horse, his body weak. I can't believe. You did it." "We did it," Rowena said. She dismounted, her entire body aching. But we're not done. She looked at the wax seal on the tube. It was the McPherson crest. She broke it. Inside was not just the Vasto Verde grant. The vellum scroll was wrapped around something else. A book. A thick, leather-bound ledger. Owen opened it. His face went pale. "What is it?" Rowena asked. It's not my father's," Owen said. "It's his. It's Kane's. It's his personal ledger. My father must have stolen it and hidden it with the charter." Owen flipped through the pages. It was a meticulous record of every crime, every bribe, every murder. "Look," Owen said, pointing. "Brody, paid, $500. For services rendered, AM ranch fire." He documented everything. Rowena scanned the page and her blood ran cold. She saw another name, a name she knew. Thomas Hayes, paid, $100. Surveying rights and silence, her father. But there was another entry, a week later. Thomas Hayes, final payment. Liability. "My God," Rowena whispered. He was part of it. At first, he took the money. And then he must have backed out. He tried to stop him. And Kane silenced him, Owen finished, his voice gentle. Rowena sank to the ground, the ledger in her lap. The man she had idolized, her father, had been a party to the McPhersons' destruction. But in the end, he had tried to do what was right, and it had cost him his life. This was never just Owen's fight. It had always been hers, too. "This," Rowena said, standing up and gripping the ledger, "is not just a charter. It's a confession." She looked at Owen, her eyes hard and clear. "Santa Fe. We ride to Santa Fe. We don't just take back the land. We take everything." The ride to Santa Fe was a 50-mile ordeal of heat, dust, and fear. They avoided the main roads, pushing their tired mounts through the high desert, sharing the last of their water. They knew Kane would not just be chasing them. He would be telegraphing ahead, painting them as the thieves and lunatics he'd always claimed they were. They arrived in Santa Fe not as conquering heroes, but as the vagrants they appeared to be. They were covered in dust, bruised, and half-starved. They didn't go to the local sheriff's office. They went straight to the one place Kane's money might not reach, the office of the U.S. Territorial Marshal. The Marshal, a man named Silas Fry, was a different breed from Brody. He was an older man with eyes that had seen everything. He listened, his face impassive, as Owen and Rowena laid out their story. He looked at Owen's rags and Rowena's bruised face. "That's a wild tale, son," Fry said when they had finished. "It is," Owen agreed, "which is why we brought proof." He laid the Vasto Verde grant on the marshal's desk. Fry's eyes widened. He knew what he was looking at. The Spanish seal, the vellum, the royal signature. It was unmistakable. This is the McPherson grant. It was thought lost in the fire, Fry said, his voice hushed. "It was," Rowena said, stepping forward. "But this wasn't." She placed the leather-bound ledger on top of the grant. "Barrett Kane's private ledger. We found it with the charter. Page 27 details the bribe to Sheriff Brody for the McPherson ranch fire. Page 40 details the murder of my father, Thomas Hayes." Marshal Fry opened the ledger. He read for 10 minutes. He did not say a word. The only sound in the office was the ticking of a clock and the faint shuffle of pages. When he finally looked up, his face was granite. "Mr. McPherson, Miss Hayes," he said, "you are officially in the protective custody of the United States government." He turned to his deputy. "Send a telegraph to Fort Union. I want a full company of cavalry. We're not just serving a warrant. We're liberating a town." A week passed. In Scorpion Creek, it was a week of quiet, ugly triumph for the men in power. Rowena Hayes's homestead was officially seized. the foreclosure notice nailed to her door like a death certificate. In the Gilded Cactus saloon, Barrett Kane, Sheriff Brody, and Gant drank to their victory, their laughter loud and confident. The McPherson problem, as Kane called it, had been solved. The last nagging loose end of his empire was gone. That was when the dust cloud appeared on the horizon. It was too large and too uniform for a simple windstorm. It was the rhythmic, pounding dust of a column of horses, moving with singular, unhurried purpose. The blue-coated soldiers of the U.S. cavalry, led by Marshal Silas Fry, did not stop to ask questions. They fanned out, securing the telegraph office, the livery, and the blacksmith's shop before Fry, and a contingent of 4 heavily armed soldiers dismounted and walked, their spurs ringing on the dusty street, straight to the Gilded Cactus. The piano music stopped. Gant, his hand on his revolver, moved to the door. "Saloon's closed, Marshal." "My business is open," Fry said, his voice a low rumble. He stepped past the foreman, his eyes as hard and grey as a gun barrel, locking on the silver-haired man at the back table. "Barrett Kane," Fry's voice boomed, silencing the room. "You are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States government, and the murders of Angus, Maria, and Sophia McPherson." Kane, for the first time in his life, looked utterly, completely surprised. A slow, incredulous smile touched his lips. He started to chuckle. "Marshal, you've been listening to lunatics. This is my town." "This is a United States territory," Fry countered. "And this," he pulled the thick ledger from his satchel and slammed it onto a table, "is your confession. I'm also arresting you for the murder of Thomas Hayes." At the sound of her father's name, Rowena appeared in the doorway, standing just behind the marshal. Owen McPherson was beside her. They were no longer the ragged refugees who had fled into the desert. They were witnesses. Kane's smile vanished, his face turning to stone. He saw Rowena. He saw Owen. He saw the ledger. He finally understood. "Brody," he barked, his voice a venomous rasp. "Arrest this man for interfering." Sheriff Brody, his face pale and sweating, fumbled for his gun. "Now, Marshal, I'm the law here." "Sheriff Brody," Fry said, not even looking at him, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, arson, and murder. Gant, Pike, you're both under arrest for, well," the marshal glanced at the thick ledger. "Pretty much everything." Kane made his move. It was fast, a lifetime of violence culminating in one last gamble. He drew his sidearm, but before he could even level it, the click, click, click of 20 rifles being cocked by the soldiers flanking the entrance and windows froze him. His hand, holding the revolver, was suspended in the air. He was a king on a chessboard, suddenly finding himself in checkmate, surrounded on all sides. Slowly, his eyes burning with a hatred that was almost physical, Kane lowered his arm and dropped the gun. The law of Scorpion Creek dissolved. The men who had ruled by fear, the cattle baron, the corrupt sheriff, the brutal foreman, were marched out into the street in chains. The townsfolk, drawn by the commotion, crept from their homes and shops. They saw Kane, Brody, and Gant disarmed and bound. It was a sight so impossible it barely registered. Mr. Hendry, the mercantile owner, stood by a hitching post, his mouth open, watching the pillars of his world collapse. Owen and Rowena rode in behind the marshal. They were the center of the town's confused, hopeful gaze. Marshal Fry stood on the porch of the Gilded Cactus. He unrolled the Vasto Verde grant. In a voice that carried to every corner of the street, he read the original charter, the legal and moral foundation of the valley. Then he held up Kane's ledger. "This," Fry declared, "is the record of this man's crimes, a confession of the McPherson fire, an admission of the murder of Thomas Hayes, a list of every bribe paid to Sheriff Brody." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This wasn't just justice, it was a revelation. The sacred line was not a delusion. It was the law. The aftermath was not a fairy tale. Justice is a pen stroke, but rebuilding is a hammer and nail day after day. The K-Bar Ranch was seized by the federal government, its assets frozen. The territorial court, in a landmark decision, recognized the Vasto Verde grant, making Owen McPherson the legal owner of the entire valley. But Owen, changed by his time in the asylum and his days as a fugitive, had no desire to be the new Cain. He saw how absolute power had poisoned the land. His first act was to ride with Rowena and the marshal to her homestead. He tore the foreclosure notice from her door himself. Then he filed a new charter in Santa Fe, breaking up the massive grant. He gave Rowena back her homestead, its deed free and clear, along with the rights to the creek Cain had dammed. The water, he declared, would be shared by all. He offered plots of land to the other families in Scorpion Creek, Mr. Hendry, the blacksmith, and the others Cain had been squeezing, on fair terms. He didn't want to be a baron. He wanted to build a community. Rowena, too, found a painful, necessary peace. The ledger had clawed her father's name, but in a complicated way. It showed he had taken Cain's money at first, but the final entry, Thomas Hayes, final payment, liability, proved he had tried to back out, to stop the monster he'd helped create. He was not a perfect hero, but a man who had died trying to find his own redemption. Weeks later, Rowena and Owen stood on the porch of her small cabin. The well was full. The creek, freed from Cain's dam, gurgled happily at the bottom of the property. The corn was green and tall. The last blood of the sacred line, Rowena said, trying the words out. She smiled at him. It sounds so grand. Owen, his hands now calloused from working to repair the ranch, took hers. It's just a name, he said. What I learned is that a line isn't sacred because of who you're born from. It's sacred because of what you're willing to protect. He looked out over the valley, their valley, peaceful and free. You, Rowena Hayes, you offered water to a dead man. You stood up to a tyrant. You walked into the lion's den. You, he said, turning to her, his eyes full of a respect that went deeper than love, are the strongest line this valley has ever seen. Rowena, the woman who had dared to offer a cup of water, finally had her land. But she had earned something more. She had earned justice. And in the unyielding desert, she had proven that the most powerful force in the land wasn't power or greed. It was a single, stubborn seed of compassion. That simple cup of water, an act of defiance against a cruel and powerful system, set in motion a reckoning that brought down an empire built on blood. Rowena's story shows us that true strength isn't in the power you hold over others, but in the kindness you show when the world is telling you to be hard. She thought she was just saving a dying man, but she was really saving an entire community, and herself. Justice, like a river in the desert, may run underground for a long time, but with enough courage, it will always find its way to the surface. Thank you for watching this story. If you were moved by Rowena's courage and Owen's fight for justice, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear a story of hope, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more true-life dramas just like this one. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a new story.